right, so Jow, I have a question for you.
I might have an answer. I don't know.
Right.
It's a podcast. I would hope I have an answer. Otherwise, we're going to be in trouble.
What is your favorite archetypal character in fiction?
Hmm.
There's a lot of them out there, right?
Well, yeah. Like I can't talk about like Jungian archetypes or anything like that because I'm not educated enough to know them. But if you're just talking about like I don't want to call it a stereotype, but like a cookie cutter
Like a trope.
mold, a trope. Yeah.
Yeah.
I like the, and this is very indicative of me, and I can see Joker rolling his eyes with a smile cracking out of the side of his mouth as he listens to this, but I like the goody two shoes main character who has a set of morals that never breaks from them. Like I know there's a lot of drama behind, having flaw and challenging your own beliefs and this and that, but I like that perfect character, whether it's Superman or like Superman's probably the most well-known type of that. And in modern day, they've tried to, flaw him and make him doubt himself and this and that. And I think, truth be told, I think that's what's wrong with modern incarnations of Superman. But I'm trying to think of a better, another example. So I would say one of my favorite characters, it's best exemplified modern days. I don't know if have you seen they're not new, but they're modern, the National Treasure movies with Nicolas Cage.
I've seen a little bit of them, but I haven't seen them that much.
Okay.
I don't know if I'd be very well quoted on it, but I would be interested in hearing what you're trying to describe.
Nicolas Cage in those movies is like my favorite type of character. He's optimistic. He's knowledgeable. Yeah. He has a set of core beliefs, and it's not that he doesn't push them on each other or on others, but he exemplifies them in every way that he can. He's unrelenting to the idea that they're wrong. He is so perfect in that mind. And
so,
he's an inspiring character, I guess.
I take it what you really like is conviction.
Right? Yes.
Like characters with conviction. Because I imagine you also like villains who have that same sort of sensibility too, where they have like a stalwart conviction in like applying themselves to their task, right?
Yeah.
That's something that I definitely see a lot less of nowadays in modern heroes in particular. I feel like actually it's interesting because I feel like more so nowadays that trait gets put on villains more so than anything. More often than not, it seems like the villains are the most have the most conviction in any sort of storyline. Almost in a way, in like I feel like a lot of modern storytelling kind of gives away this idea that like having conviction is a flaw, or that having conviction is somehow like a morally deranged standpoint to have. And I think it's kind of a reflection of how people feel about like how difficult it is to piece apart like all the different moral sort of arguments that are out there nowadays, because nobody wants to get involved in all that sticky political or whatever stuff.
Sure.
So I think a lot of times the people that we see most villainized often are ones that just like have that sort of stalwart sort of attitude, right? Because they're the character types that kind of get labeled as like closed-minded,
intolerant, absolutely.
Yeah, or intolerant or stuff like that. But I that's kind of a side tangent to the ultimate topic, right, of today's episode, which is talking about archetypes in storytelling, and not just archetypes, but like not just in terms of characters, but also tropes in terms of like story, like how stories can exhibit themselves, right? In a more abstract way. I guess that's a better way of putting it. Like, you know, there's the archetypes or the tropes that we sort of that have been long categorized, in the sense of you've got your rising, you know, your rising action, climax, denouement type stuff, right? But then there's archetypes like one of my personal favorite plot archetypes is what's called, on TV tropes, it's called the Xanatos Gambit. And they got the terminology from the show Gargoyles. I don't know if you remember the cartoon show Gargoyles.
I do.
But there's a character voiced by the guy who's #1 in Star Trek: The Next Generation. I can't remember his name, but his name is Xanatos, and he's like the villain of the show. And he's the super genius, kind of a Lex Luthor type character. And his whole thing is just like, there's a point in the story where he arranges things that no matter what happens, he wins. So like, even if he dies, he wins. Like, he's just like, he's planned out everything so well that no matter, like even if the heroes win, they still are defeated. And I love that idea especially from a villain standpoint, because it's kind of it creates like an interesting tension where it's like, there are moments in life where I think everybody kind of comes at encounters where you feel like no matter what you do, you can't win.
Yeah.
And
isn't there a word for that? Like I want to say the word fulsome. Is that the right word?
I have no idea.
Now I have to Google it.
Folsom? Like, how would you spell that? FOLSOM?
Yeah, no, never mind.
Place in California.
Complimentary or flattering to an excessive degree. Of large size or quantity, generous or abundant. No, it must not be the word. I know, but there's a word, I think it starts with an F, that usually means like there is no win. You know what I mean?
Feudal.
Like there's feudal, that might be it. That might have been the word I was going for. Okay. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, there are a lot of instances in life that seem really feudal, and I think that's I think a lot in regards to stories lately. I think a lot in terms of what I call in my head like max tension, and I've been thinking about a lot of what are different ways you can make max tension within a story.
Yeah, and
like that's one that I can think of. But going into like character archetypes, I'm a big fan of. I'm a very big fan of like trickster archetypes. So like, I really enjoy characters that are not necessarily like villainous, but just like chaotic in the ways of like their main goal is to create chaos just for the sake of fun, you know.
Loki.
Like, yeah, Loki. I mean, I actually like have a character in Trailer Park Warlock who is pretty much similar sort of god archetype, who's Set, the god Discord. He's one of my favorite characters to write, just because it's fun to kind of come up with different weird scenarios and like see how that, and also think about how all that chaos sort of like creates macroscopic disturbance in the world and stuff like that, and sort of like chaos builds on chaos. In the real world, I would say that's kind of I would imagine why a lot of people like Elon Musk, because he kind of is that trickster archetype. His Twitter personality is that trickster archetype.
Yeah,
where you're not really sure, you know, what's the angle, right?
So when you say trickster, from now on, I'm going to say troll. In my head, you're going to say it's trickster. I'm going to hear troll. I'm a big fan of Elon Musk, but dude be trolling constant. Like, you know what I mean? Like he's out there to stir up shit. And like you said, the chaos type thing. And I absolutely understand what you mean now. So like a trickster, yeah, but to me, it's more of a modern definition of troll. Does that make sense? Where it's like, just starting trouble for the sake of trouble, for the joy of it, realizing everything is overall meaningless. You know what I mean? Like, who gives a fuck? We're all gonna die. Well, it's just.
I think for me too, it's I relate to that as when I was younger, I did a lot of my own set of like just mischievous actions online, or like I always tried to keep it within sort of a bounds, right? Because I think you can troll too far, but I think, like, for instance, like me and my friend Austin wrote and drew a comic strip in Austin's college newspaper that made 0 sense just because we wanted to get on the nerves of like the people who are reading the college newspaper. And to the point that we kept doing this and making so many people perturbed, to the point that we held like a seminar at his college to explain the comic strip. And the explanation of the comic strip was equivalently nonsense. Like, we just, like, me and Austin brainstormed for like an hour of like, okay, what bullshit are we going to come up with to explain this? I made a PowerPoint presentation with illustrations. Like, Austin like came up with some seemingly coherent sounding like stuff about the Lovelace ratio, which is a totally made up thing, and like the Platohedron, and just like we made up a dead philosopher named Tainer Hammarskjöld to like be like, this is our principal philosophical,
I love
like,
it.
anchor. It was so much fun to do because I love that kind of creativity. Because there's no like goal to it. It's just kind of you see what happens. You know what I mean?
Well, there is a little bit of a goal. It's to elicit a reaction from whoever you're inflicting it upon.
Right.
But that's art. That's art.
That's art. Like, you're gonna elicit a reaction, but we weren't sure. I mean, the reaction we want to elicit is like frustration and annoyance from people who want like a serious, like,
see,
who demand a serious explanation for this.
The beauty of what you're describing right now, and how we're talking about how it's art, is that is art in its most bulletproof form. When you don't care about how it's received, and in fact, if it's poo-pooed upon, like you said before, you still win.
Oh, yeah.
If
absolutely.
you troll someone and you get them on your side, you win. If you troll someone and you drive them to the brink of insanity because they just fucking hate you because it's so stupid and ridiculous and and they lose their fucking mind, you win. Like, it is a win-win scenario.
That's the Xanatos Gambit. Going back to my previous thing. And that's what draws me to the trickster archetype, because I mean, there are trickster archetypes that I think that can actually be malicious in the world, but I like the ones that are, I like the kind of trickster archetypes that have that sort of, it's mischievous but fun and not malevolent. It's just like, if you're annoyed by this is your own fucking fault. Like, that's a problem with your brain, kind of a thing. Where it's almost like, I think there's a kind of tricksterism or trolling that can actually be educationally useful. And I've learned about this a little bit from the way that a lot of like Zen monks who are trying to teach disciples, they do the similar kind of thing where they just start fucking with students.
Really?
Because your first assumption when a student comes in is that a student's going to look at them as like, oh, you're the master, you know what you're doing, I'm just going to follow your lead, and I'm not going to think for myself. I'm going to expect you to hand me, the path, Zen. And every Zen monk has the exact same, they find the path the exact same way, which is they totally let go of any gods or masters and just find that answer that's in themselves. So like, whenever they see this behavior come out of students, they just start acting a fool. They just start doing like wild shit and just like kind of like almost making bets with like, oh, I bet my student would not cut off his arm if I if I like, started suggesting it and stuff like that. So it's like, so the idea is, I think for Zen monks who are in that position, they really want to break their students out of this idea that they are in a student-teacher relationship. And that's how they go about it, is just like using just spontaneous sort of like out of nowhere kind of shit to disrupt their students' sort of assumptions. So like and in some ways I actually kind of think that a lot of trolls, even on the internet, sort of behave in that way, even if they don't intend to. They actually do, in a way, behave in a manner that breaks people out of their sort of tunnel vision.
Yeah.
Right? So that they get out of for the people who, intellectually pick up on what's going on, they break out of their stupor and sort of like actually take it less seriously. It's the same reason why like a lot of like performance art or like just like the weird art shit that we don't see as much nowadays, but like used to be such a staple of art, like in the early 1900s till like pop art era.
Well, I thought you were referencing like Andy Kaufman.
Oh, I mean, Andy Kaufman, of course. I mean, he's definitely of that tradition, like it's part of the reason why I love the Dadaist movement, is that it was, as much as there is Dadaist art that isn't very good, like a lot of it is very interesting in that it kind of breaks you out of your assumptions about like what art is. So anyway, that's a huge tangent in regards to sort of one particular archetype, right? And there are really, in my mind, there are hundreds of different archetypes, because ultimately what archetypes are just calcifications of people's observations of patterns that happen in life, right? So like, there's a kind of archetype that I think every particular artist has in their body of work. So like, for instance, I know for myself, like, there is an archetypal character who I basically name. Like, I have a name for him, and he has the same name in every story he appears. His name's Mason Douglas. And like his archetype is kind of like he always represents like some kind of lawman. So like in one story, he's a private investigator. In another story, like he's like an FBI agent. So he's always kind of playing like this vigilant sort of character, whether or not he's competent or incompetent. He serves the same function within the story. And I'm curious, you, Jow, like if you yourself have any archetypes in your own stories that you've kind of become aware of over time.
It's fucking crazy that you bring this up right now, because as we talked about last week, and anyone following me on any social medias happens to know, I'm currently in the process of recutting digits. Now, I made digits in 2009, between 2009 and 2011, right? 2011? Yeah, 2011 is when it premiered. 2009, I think, is when we started filming it. That's neither here nor there. The other day, I was recutting the opening montage, as I mentioned. I think I mentioned it on air regarding combining montages. Now, before I'm going to leave that there for a second. Before I get too far into what I'm saying, I want to remind everybody that I'm currently working on my film Haunted, right? Which is a horror movie. Digits was a coming-of-age comedy mockumentary. I don't want to call it exploitation, but it's definitely a shock comedy type thing where, there's some like crazy shit going on. Two very different genres. That's the point I'm trying to make. The opening scene in Digits, or the opening montage, I should say. Montage has a whole ton of different things happening. Guys just kind of cruising in the car, stuffing their face with food, fighting with lightsabers, like just doing like stupid dude stuff that you do when you're like a young guy. One of the things that was in there was based off of a stupid story my mom told me that she used to do when they were kids at like Halloween time. They used to walk along the side of the road and they would take scarecrows down from people's decorations or cornfields or wherever and throw them in front of cars as they came by and scream out, "My brother!" right as the car hit the scarecrow. Okay? That inspired a scene in Digits where I had TS laying on the ground in the opening montage as a dead person, and they cover him with a blanket, and one of the other guys is dressed like a cop, and one of the guys is on the curb crying, and a car of a random person pulls up or whatever, and it was Buddy. And then all of a sudden the sheet sits up and TS has come back to life as a zombie, and he's walking towards the car of this innocent bystander, right, with blood dripping from his mouth and his face painted white, and he's got his arms out like Frankenstein, like a zombie. I'm watching that and I went, Jesus fucking Christ. TS and Taylor, the lead character in Haunted, are the same fucking character. Because in the opening scene of Haunted, they are doing a Halloween setup, and Taylor plays a witch who rises from the grave and chases a little trick-or-treater down the path with black goo coming out of her mouth as she reaches out for her. Subconsciously, I did the same thing twice. And then as I looked at it and I examined it, I realized the archetypes of both of those characters are exactly the same. They both, and this is contradictory to what I was saying before in my thing about like Nicolas Cage and Superman, but they both are know-it-alls. They know it all. You can't tell them nothing. And it's like the shadow, I guess you would call it, of the character that I do like, where this person knows so much, you can't tell them anything, and they affect change negatively on others, but they are so stubborn and refuse to change that it impacts everyone around them negatively to the point where they have to change if they want the people around them to stop suffering. And that is both the crux in Haunted and in Digits. So there must be something subconsciously drilled in my brain about being a know-it-all and being closed-minded and refusing to change. And yet I was talking, 10 minutes ago about how much I love that character. And that's the kind of dark side thing. So that was one of the characters that really is starting to become noticeable to me in my work that I repeat. Completely different style. Both characters are different people. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I want the audience to understand this. Archetype and personality are two very different things. Like a character can be two opposite ends of the spectrum, but the same archetype. You know what I mean? Like they fit the mold. They check off all the dots. But if you were to say, "Oh, this character is that character, and that character is this character," most people wouldn't be able to put it together, because TS is crass. He makes, ignorant comments, and he's a shock comedy stand-up type person. Whatever will make people laugh because he's insecure about his father passing away in a car crash. Whereas Taylor is a completely different character. She is ignorant because she's bored and she's seen it all, and she just wants something exciting, and she likes to be admired. You know what I mean? Like she wants to be praised for her knowledge. Still the same archetype, different personalities, different reasonings, different motivations, all that kind of stuff. And I just wanted to point out that that's important to understand when you're
that's absolutely important, because I think
a character.
Because it's like in a lot of ways, you can look at Spock, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Gandalf are all of a similar archetype, right? They all fulfill the same role within the story, which is that they provide a basis for the logic and the knowledge in the story, in the overall world of the story. They are kind of situationally the ground upon which people are able to argue against, and also have sort of an acknowledgement of like what is real and what is not real. So like in Star Wars, Obi-Wan is the main character who validates the presence of the Force, and also explains a lot of the world to Luke, right? Like kind of explains like the motivating factors for everything. and gets Luke going on his adventure, basically. Gandalf fulfills the exact same role in Lord of the Rings, where he gives Frodo basically the motivating factor for like why the Ring of Power needs to be destroyed, why things are the way that they are in that world. Spock is a little bit less a motivating factor in Star Trek, but fulfills very much the same roles of like giving Captain Kirk sort of a groundedness and a base for which he can make decisions off of, because Spock always represents sort of like the epicenter of logic and knowledge in the world.
Right.
So, you know, like you can argue with Spock, but you can't necessarily deny what he has to say, basically. And all three of those characters have that in common. And that's sort of what ties them together as an archetype, which is sort of the wise old man archetype to a certain extent.
Yeah.
And so like you can go deeper into like Jungian archetypes and stuff like that. But ultimately, I think what Jung did is he kind of popularized things that had already been existing previously, because before Jung was around, the tarot deck was around, and literally all the tarot deck is just a collection of archetypes. And the same thing, and then curiously enough, the same thing with like the Eastern Chinese like sort of version of the tarot. Although that's kind of a very vague way of describing it, but the I Ching works in a very similar way, where it is a collection of all these life events that you can take as like a body of knowledge to work with. And so, because, you know, throughout history, people have, especially more in ancient history, people had more time to kind of observe and pay attention and write down or record what was going on.
Yeah.
And because a lot of ancient wisdom was sort of interested in being able to acknowledge nature's pattern. Well, that's what they did, is they just like tried to boil it down into the most generalized patterns to pass on to the future, to be like, hey, you know, don't be surprised if this shit happens, because it happens all the time. And I can tell you why, because I recorded every little bit of it I saw and collated it into these systems. And so stories, in a certain sense, pass along that system. And then also, like, we kind of mutate it and evolve it to a certain extent, right? And have it kind of fit more within the modern frameworks that we live in. So, like, you know, you look at like, let's say Marvel Avengers, right? Like, and I'm actually kind of grabbing right now. I'm kind of grasping for straws right now, because I can't actually think of who would be the wise old man in Marvel Adventure. And
well, in the actual, like, the Avengers movies, or the entire franchise.
Let's say in the Avengers movies, just to keep it concise. Maybe we should expand to the franchise.
No, because in the franchise itself, it fluctuates from film to film.
Oh, you know what? I would actually say the person that fulfills that role is Agent Coulson. He even does a very similar function that happens to most wise old man characters, where he dies.
Right.
And in that same, like, it's either him or it's Nick Fury.
I was gonna say Nick Fury overall, but if you were talking about the first Avengers film, it's definitely Coulson. But if it's the other Avengers films, it's definitely Nick Fury. 100%.
Yeah, so I think, and you can trade them back and forth, because they're both, you know, two of the most important SHIELD agents. So they're essentially, you know, they are ostensibly the same character in a lot of ways. But, like, their function, once again, is to provide the motivating factor for all the heroes, and then to also supply the information that grounds everything together. So, like, you know, and if you want to go, you know, and then you can pick apart all the different archetypes that each individual Avenger character represents, right? Because, like, Captain America is sort of your archetype, right, that you love, which is the the stalwart man of conviction, right? Who does the moral thing and the right thing. Tony Stark is the know-it-all, who's the shadow of that character, and they happen to be like the two main poles within, the pulse of that story, right? Like the story always kind of goes back and forth between their worldviews, and that's because they are light and shadow of each other, basically.
Yeah.
And then I would have a harder time. I was going to go into sort of like all the other different archetypes, like with the Hulk and stuff, but I might not have the full mental capacity to kind of piece it or take it apart, right?
Yeah.
But like, I mean, I don't know, like the Hulk like represents like the duality of man sort of character, right? So like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, like the idea that there is within every person there's also like a beast. So like the Wolfman, another example. To a lesser extent, like Frankenstein, although Frankenstein I think is his own kind of archetype, but is similar, right? Where it's like Frankenstein kind of represents
Frankenstein is Jurassic Park.
Yes.
It's the idea. It's very clearly and concisely summed up by Ian Malcolm. Just because you can doesn't mean you should, and that's like kind of a struggle that I think every human being has. Do you know what I mean? With any given situation where it's, oh, I can run over this squirrel, or I can slam on my brakes.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And in that moment, you make a decision, and then based on that decision, you have to live with repercussions. And, like you either kill the squirrel and that haunts you for the rest of the week, or you slam on your brakes and you get rear-ended and you are late for work and then you lost your job. And you know what I mean? And you have to, it's like there are different sides to every decision. And it's that idea of, well, I'm a monster either way. I either created the monster or I didn't create the monster, and that's causing suffering. You know what I mean? It's that struggle within every human being about whether or not you should take some kind of an action.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, Mary Shelley had her own archetype attached to the character, I think, in the original title, too. Because I want to say Frankenstein was originally titled Frankenstein, the modern-day Prometheus. So
that sounds right. I think I've heard that before. Yeah.
So that was the archetype she thought about with Frankenstein. And I think, she's talking about the doctor, right? Dr. Frankenstein, because what Dr. Frankenstein was going to do was basically bring eternal life, right?
Yep.
To humanity. But because he didn't understand quite what he was wielding, he ended up creating a monster out of it.
Right.
So in the original mythology of Prometheus brought fire to humanity, but then he ended up suffering for it by the hands of the gods. So I think, when Mary Shelley wrote that book, she had this idea of there is like a consequence attached. I mean, initially what you were saying, right? There's a consequence attached
to every action.
Yeah, to every action, into delving into places where the gods tread, basically.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that explores guilt, and I only read into that so well because that's the prominent theme in Haunted. Spoiler alert. Is kind of rectifying that no matter what decision you make, there's going to be positive and negative. Do you know what I mean? And at some point you need to decide whether if the positive is for you or for someone else. And most of the time for human beings, and this is what interests me about those types of characters, is you cannot be completely selfless. This idea that people should never be selfish, to me, is horrible, because That's what destroys a human soul. Like if you're there and like, I know there's a lot of bullshit. People say, oh, well, doing things for others brings me joy. Bullshit. That applies at Christmas. And you know what I mean? Like the other 365 days of the year, yeah, it feels good to give somebody a ride or help them out when they need it to here and there. But for the most time, you have to do stuff to do better for you. Because otherwise, what's the fucking point of enjoying your life? You know what I mean? Like, you're not a person, you're a service at that point when you don't take enjoyment for yourself. But we've been taught and embedded that, like, doing things for yourself can be selfish and bad and don't do that. And that wears on not only mental health, but, like, your soul. Like, sure. And so I think those kinds of stories, when that archetype pops up, I think that's the reason why the Hulk and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, you know what I mean? Like that duality that kind of comes with it. And they put a lot of that stuff on Batman these days too, which it works well with Batman, and Spider-Man. Spider-Man, I think, is the best modern day representation of that, even more than Hulk. Sure. That like they've kind of made Hulk a little bit more one-dimensional, which is hard to do with a character that changes from being to being. Yeah. But when you look at somebody like Spider-Man, like they completely flesh out that struggle, and that's really where the heart of it lies. And I think that's really what makes things interesting about archetypes is they don't die; they're just us on a different day. Like on Tuesday, I can be, you know what I mean? On Tuesday, I can be Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and on Wednesday, I can be fucking Dracula. Where you know what I mean? Where it's just a very I don't want to say sneaky, but you know what I mean? Like I operate in the shadows. I'm thinking ahead. I'm like, what am I going to do to get what I want? Da, 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 da. And then other days, you know, I'm fucking Superman, where I look at my son and I'm like, I want to give this kid the best day he's ever had right now. We're going to go get hamburgers from McDonald's. We're going to go play at the playground. We're going to get a balloon. I don't know why we need a balloon, but he wants a balloon, so we're getting a balloon. We're going to drink juice and we're going to watch Paw Patrol till we pass out. Like, you know what I mean? Like you just want to give and just completely be joyful. Archetypes represent all of us. Like, human beings are not even 3-dimensional. We're like 60-dimensional. Sure. There's so many different angles you can come at. And I think what's important about archetypes is choosing the right one for your story makes your story universal. They talk about target audiences and shit where it's like, oh, this is just meant for 6-year-old girls. Yeah, but dad's got to sit there too. Right. You know what I mean? And watch this most of the time. Or even mom. You know, you make a show for a 6-year-old girl and 42-year-old mom wants, you know, something for her out of it. And if you can bury an archetype in there, it's like, oh, I can see myself there a little bit and I can get into that. That's the shit that makes money. You know what I mean? Like I've talked to women and I've asked them like, what's the best movie of all time? And I've had some women say to me, oh, Shawshank Redemption. There is not one fucking woman in that entire movie. There are hundreds of men. Hundreds.
Right.
No women. 0. Unless you count Raquel Welch on his wall. And I highly doubt any of the women were like, that's me. I'm the piece of paper on the wall. I'm represented. Like none of them are thinking that. But they look at Andy Dufresne and there are days when we feel cold. Yeah. And you know what I mean? Like, and we kick ourselves for things that we did in the past that we didn't realize were bad, or, you know, or punish ourselves for things that we did that maybe we don't deserve to, and this and that. And you can relate with that, and it's universal. And I think that's one of the things, because I know there's going to be somebody listening to this podcast at some point or another, even though our viewership is growing. Not on YouTube, on Anchor and podcasts. Like, we're actually getting listens, which is cool. Anyway, I digress.
Well, I was going to say, just with Shawshank Redemption, I think something that people universally also relate to is a story about abuses of justice, abuses of the system, right? Because it's a story of like man versus the system kind of a thing. And I think that is one of the less so, like, I love the character of Andy Dufresne, but like less so him and more his predicament, right? Just that premise is something that grabs people because, you know, like how many times has any given individual been in a situation where they have to advocate for themselves against the government, right? Like, let's just say the IRS, right? Like, it's basically, it becomes your word versus the word of somebody who has absolute authority in a situation. And that's another one of those sort of like, it's a max tension premise where it's like, you begin to wonder, what would I do if I were in that situation? Frequently. And that is so often, those are the kind of premises that grab people, are the ones where they, where you start to think, well, like, if I were in that situation, what the fuck would I do, But anyway, not to, where were you going from there?
I don't know. I was talking myself down a long pier, hoping to reach an ocean of epiphany. But no, I think that the point that I was trying to make was that there are people who look at, and much like how I talked about when we did like the Blake Snyder, Save the Cat deconstruction, was that people will look at stuff like Archetypes and say, oh, that's cookie cutter, that's formulaic, that's what, and I'm like, no, man, that's fucking primal, that's universal. Like, you want to, like, if you want to have a deep, unique conversation, talk to your fucking mother. Like, a one-on-one with one person, that's great. Do that. You don't tell one story necessarily to one person. Like, you want to reach people. Like, it's a collective thing when you're telling stories. You want to, it's not about the widest audience possible for the sake of dollars or ego, right? It's about the idea that, and correct me if I'm wrong, maybe it's just me, and this is me talking like Superman or Nick Cage at a National Treasure, but when you are as an artist and you sit down and you decide to tell a story, you decide to craft something together, your end goal is to have moved the people that witness your story in whatever medium you so choose forward together. You want them all to come away feeling a little bit better, or thinking in a way that's going to move society, humanity towards betterment.
Sure.
And what you believe. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Another way I was going to put that too is, and I guess this is for me, like, artists that I really appreciate are artists. I appreciate a lot of different artists, but one particular kind of artist I really appreciate, artists who are able to make the personal universal. So, like, that is a very difficult thing to do, and not everybody is able to land that, right? But, like, as part of the reason why I like David Bowie as an artist, he takes very personal songs, so obscurely personal that you have to, like, dig through the lyrics to kind of figure out what the fuck they're about. But there's such good songs that, like, you get pulled into them anyway. And he's able to find very universal themes in those songs to elaborate on. You know what I mean? And same thing with, like, why I liked Midnight Mass. It was a very personal story for, the guy who directed it and put it together. But he was able to create so much of a universal appeal to it because he was able to pull from themes that you're going to relate to no matter what kind of society you come from, because everybody's been in that kind of situation, like the sheriff, where you're the person that nobody really likes or trusts,
Yep.
Or the situation that Riley is in, where, like, you've been the person who's done something really horrible and you don't feel trusted by your community, but you have to kind of, like, figure out how to fit back in. Mm-hmm. So, like, that story does such a good job of putting together all these different sort of archetypes, right? In doing it in such a way that the story would function if you changed, if you exchanged all the names and faces, right? And did, like, just shuffled it around with different names and faces, but you kept the archetypes, it would still work, right? Like, to a certain extent, archetypes are almost like the skeleton of a story. Like they're almost like the musculature and the skeleton of the story that actually make it function, are like the background code. And then every choice that an artist makes from that point on is almost like purely aesthetic in regards to, you know, okay, how is this main character going to look? So like, with another example, Jack Burton in Big Trouble in Little China, like he as an archetype is a particularly John Carpenter archetype who is like, well, no, I mean, he's kind of a know-it-all, right? He's kind of, he's a know-it-all and he's like a fish out of water. So like, he's like that in itself as a character is like a max tension within itself, because Jack Burton thinks he knows everything about how to deal with like, you know, being in fights and stuff, and like he's seen everything, but clearly when you're watching the movie, like he has no fucking clue what's going on because it's like bigger than him, right? Yeah. It's like ancient Chinese magic. It's like, you know, conflicts that go centuries in the making. But nevertheless, because he's so caught in his own sense of like knowing him, like thinking that he knows everything, right? That creates like a comedic tension throughout the movie. And I just, you know, like I love those are kind of some of my favorite sort of characters, where a lot of the times the forward action, or not the forward action, but like the character becomes almost a comment on themselves. You know what I mean? Like, where it's like, it's funny because like Jack Burton's kind of the comedic. He's like the comedic. What do they call that? The fucking
comedy relief.
Thank you. I don't know why that term was lost in my mind. He's like the comedic relief in the story, but he's also the motivating factor. You know, like, but he's only motivating factor because he shows up. Like that's literally the only reason why he's the motivating factor, is he's just like the perspective by which we're able to look into the story. So I think of that, and I definitely see how like that character has influenced like me writing Jake Baker, who, not even intending this, like has a very similar name, has a very, you know what I mean? Like, yeah. I am always interested in like archetypically what's called the fool, right? The character who is sort of in over their heads and totally fresh to the situation and is ill suited towards it and has to sort of like adapt to the situation. It is inevitably going to be like full of error. And all the enjoyment of the story sort of comes from the error that like that character goes about in accomplishing their goal. To a lesser extent, you know, like the main character in Die Hard kind of is like that to some extent, sure. Right? Like he's often every movie he finds himself in a like over his head, right? Why is he even in this situation? Yeah. Repeatedly from film to film. And the driving force of the film is sort of like watching him adapt to it and deal with it while fucking up along the way. And I love that kind of character because it's a very human. It's a human kind of character where it's like you're all like the strength of the character is actually their flaws. And yeah, that's what makes that character so sympathetic to people, is like, oh, well, I could see myself fucking up like that in that situation too. Yeah. You know? So anyway, Jow, did you have any further thoughts in regards to sort of some of that stuff that we've been talking about for archetypes?
Well, I think when people listen to our podcast, I think one of the things that they're doing is trying to answer problems that they're facing in their works. So, I would definitely say I mean, you might disagree with me on this because you're well studied on it with the tarot and the Jungian stuff and all that kind of stuff. But when you're struggling with character archetypes, I think it's very important for you to stop and think, not you specifically, Mr. Rainwater, everybody else. Stop and think about your favorite characters in whatever story, whether it's TV show, movies, book, whatever, maybe. Stop and think about those characters and then start examining why, like research them and find out what archetypes they are, and then use those characters in your stories. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not, you're not, so you have like Gene Wilder's Willy Wonka, one of a kind, right?
Yeah.
Tell me if there is evidence, or if there is pretty obvious evidence that Chandler from Friends was based on that character.
I mean, I could see it.
Dry, sarcastic, always with a, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Just constantly, you know, doesn't really care about other people in terms of stuff, but will just say things that mock things like relentlessly.
Yeah.
Could basically be the same character. No one ever says, oh, Chandler's just a ripoff Willy Wonka, because he doesn't have a candy factory. He doesn't wear a top hat. You know, he doesn't do all that kind of stuff. But it's the same archetype, very much so. So when you're crafting your story, take the characters that you already love, look up what their archetype is, kind of study it, and then realize and apply that to your character. And also look up other characters that are like that. You know what I mean? Like other, you know, characters that fit that archetype. Watch that media. Watch the decisions made that differentiate them and open up your mind as to where you could go from that thing. Like every archetype starts at one point, but they each are facing a different direction. You know what I mean? North, south, east, west, and they see things differently than the other ones. Chandler and Willy Wonka are the same archetype, but one's facing north, one's facing east. And they're not going to see the same thing. They're not going to relate the same way to certain things. They're not going to have the same thoughts about how to solve problems. But they are the same archetype. So that's my point in terms of problem solving for anybody that's listening. I think you really need to take a step back. If you're already working on your thing, step back and try and understand what character you're already writing. If you're starting one, think about your favorite character, or characters, I should say. See how it applies to the thematic premise that you're presenting and the plot and this and that, and then just kind of whittle it down to make maybe one or two. But then once you get there and you have that archetype, this is very important, I think. And this is something I think we should not leave out, because this is something, I don't know if we've talked about it in the past. I'm going to have to go through our back catalog and make sure. But at some point, I want to do an episode about supporting characters.
Oh, yeah.
Your supporting characters need to be archetypes as well. And that's one of the reasons why they shine in great movies. And, well, they're not in bad movie or bad movies. That's kind of the point. You know what I'm saying? Like, you look at Pirates of the Caribbean. Captain Jack Sparrow was a side character to start. He took over that franchise because everybody fell in love with him. But Will Turner is 100% the heroic Prince Charming. You know, and Keira Knightley is the damsel in distress. She's not weak, or, you know what I mean? Like, they went a different way with it, but those are definitely archetypes. But Jack Sparrow was 100% the trickster, right? He's definitely that character.
That is like his character type, right?
Right.
Like, and that's definitely what he accomplishes throughout the movie. Like, he has aspects that are similar to, I can't remember what the name of it is for, like, it's the same sort of persona that like Han Solo fits into, right? Which is like the lone wolf, basically.
Right.
So, like, Jack Sparrow is kind of the lone wolf, but mostly the trickster. He's sort of he's out for his own, but he also causes a lot of chaos, and sometimes he sides with the main character.
Right.
And definitely going what you're saying, like, I really agree with that a lot, that a good supporting character is necessary seasoning for your story. You know, it's like your main character might be like the chicken, but you still got to do something with that fucking chicken. You got to have some salt, some pepper. You got to have something to dress it up, basically, and to give it, to build tension, to build interrelational tension with, to give. You had talked about Jurassic Park earlier, like. Ian Malcolm plays such a good supporting character to Alan Grant because he's kind of in some ways not necessarily a foil, but he is kind of a shadow to a certain extent to Alan Grant.
Yeah.
Because Alan Grant's kind of like, he is this the scientist in a field that is not like the most popular thing ever. He doesn't make a big show of himself. And Ian Malcolm's like, he's a charmer. He's he's extroverted, and he exudes sort of a popularity sensibility to him. He is extremely good with people, where Alan Grant is like not good with people at all, and is more focused on, I just want to do my work. I just want to do it well. Yeah. And I want to, make sure everybody knows how intelligent I am. Whereas Ian Malcolm does it very effortlessly, to a point that like it's clear in the movie, like Alan Grant kind of envies it or like resents it to a certain extent.
Yeah, absolutely. I think he wants to, it's the life that he can't live. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like
exactly.
It's not that he's not, he can't, he's so, oddly enough, convicted in his own stance that he is unable and unwilling to change.
Yep.
And
absolutely.
That's 100% where it is. There's a book that I was thinking about and I forgot about it, and then I just pulled it up on my Kindle. It's called The Complete Writer's Guide to Heroes and Heroines, 16 Master Archetypes. And I just want to run through this really quickly because this was a great book for me, and I just want to bounce them off you, Mr. Rainwater, since I know we're wrapping up, but I'm very curious to know how these reflect in tarot.
For sure.
So you have a character, hero character, the Chief. The Chief is a leader. People instinctively look to this man for their answers. He's a man who seizes control whenever possessible. Active, dynamic, strong-willed, urgently needs to fix problems and produce results. Rarely takes time to build a consensus or garner support, not unless he is forced to in order to achieve his goals.
That would be the Knight of Swords in the tarot. Although kind of similar to the some aspects of the Emperor as well.
The Bad Boy. The bad boy struts into every room, daring one and all to knock the chip from his shoulder. It may seem that he cares nothing for the opinion of others, but in fact, the reverse is true. All his life, he has been pointed out as a bad example, so he does his best to maintain that reputation. As far as he is concerned, it is not his fault other people cannot or will not see the man beneath the image.
That's basically a Han Solo character.
Pocket that, because there might be one that you might want to use.
I'm sure there's going to be another archetype that's going to come up.
The best friend. Everyone needs a best friend, a pal with broad shoulders to cry on, a guy with a sympathetic ear, ready to hear about the latest catastrophe, decent, kind, and responsible. The best friend is a buddy who can be counted on, whether the chips are down or things are looking up. He's also very good in a crisis. While others are hysterical, this man's calm, capable presence often soothes the troubled waters. He finds the solution, negotiates the peace, and provides the buffer between warring parties. People instinctively trust him to be fair, and he never disappoints.
That'd be the Justice card in tarot, to a certain extent. Yeah.
The Charmer. The Charmer. He is sparkle and glitz, allure and appeal, exuding enormous charisma. He showers the people in his life with gifts of laughter and happiness. He's always fun, often irresistible, and frequently unreliable. Gathering companions and friends along the way, he spins a web of fascination around everyone he touches. But when things get going tough, this man generally gets going. He creates magical illusions without seeming to try, and many are drawn under his spell. He can seduce anyone out of their souls and delights in charming the birds from their trees.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the trickster archetype, but also in the tarot, that would be the Knight of Cups.
This might be my favorite one. The Lost Soul. A tormented man filled with angst and passion, the lost soul drifts through life with a heavy heart and a wounded spirit. He's dramatic, intriguing, and secretive. This misfit has never adapted to society. A tremendous physical or emotional injury has produced a baffling puzzle of a man. Mystery and solitude surround him, and he cannot find a way to rid himself of the pain he carries with him wherever he goes. A man with a past who yearns for love and acceptance, he never seems to find the key that opens the door to happiness. This man has a poet's voice, an artist's creative genius, and a writer's grasp on emotion. Never finding solace from his aching torment, he tries to distract himself by creating a sanctuary of peace. He is attuned to every nuance, be it someone's expression or the flight of a bird, and he always remembers.
That's a archetype that used to be really popular, I feel like, in the aughts, in like the 90s, but like has kind of fallen away to a certain extent. And the tarot, that's like 3 of Swords, 9 of Swords. Those all kind of deal with dealing with betrayal, or dealing with sort of a sense of being haunted by the past, basically.
Right. The Professor. There's only 2 more after this.
Okay.
Is there a mystery that needs to be solved? Are your tax forms inexplicable? The Professor has all the answers. He takes the time to examine every aspect of any issue. This guy is logical, introverted, and faithful. No fast breaks or hurried decisions for him. When he makes a commitment, he invariably follows through, but he will do it in his own time and only after all the facts are in. No urgency will keep him from analyzing a problem from all angles.
Yeah, that's the wise old man, to a certain extent anyway. In the tarot, that would be the King and Queen of Swords. I'm trying to think of what in the major arcana that would be related to, but I can't right now. So we'll move on.
The Swashbuckler is always on the go. His motto is action, action, and more action. He is physical, daring, and colorful. Figuring out how to scale a dangerous wall or finding a way to save the day is easy for this man. He loves to leave his mark on every exploit, so he chooses the most rash and flamboyant method of achieving his aim. Impulsive and creative, this man lives for the next adventure. He's too restless for a boring desk job, too impetuous for long-term commitments. But if his imagination is fired with stories of treasure and romance, he quickly joins the team and is an asset in any endeavor.
That's a fun archetype that we don't really see as much anymore. I'm trying to think in the tarot what that would be. Oh my God, I'm trying to think. Have there been any more modern stories with that archetype?
Yes.
What comes to mind?
I'm going to get to that when we get to the end of this, after the next one.
All right.
So the last one is the Warrior.
Okay.
Dark and dangerous, justice is this man's watchword. He is remote, driven, and controlled. The Warrior's standards of conduct are high, and heaven help those who fail to meet them, including himself. He sees everything in black and white, right or wrong. Shades of gray are I don't know that word. In his opinion, they are only excuses. He is the judge and the jury, and if necessary, the hangman too. The Warrior believes evil cannot go unpunished. He cannot allow the bad guys to walk away, so trouble seems to follow him wherever he goes. His commitment to righting wrongs can lead him into dark alleys and seedy side streets, but it is impossible for him to lay down his sword of honor. He will fight the good fight until justice has won or he is dead. Merciless with his victims, or with his enemies, his friends he is loyal unto death. He is the ultimate protector, the defender of all who are weak and vulnerable. Once he has given his word, his commitment, he can always be counted upon to come through. So that's it for the hero archetypes.
All right.
We were talking about assigning the Avengers before.
Yeah.
Cap is the chief. Iron Man is the bad boy. The best friend, I'm going to say...
It's kind of Thor, a little bit.
Kind of. I was thinking Thor was a little bit more of the warrior.
Sure, yeah.
The Lost Soul is definitely Hulk.
I don't know. Thor isn't really the warrior, though, because Thor actually, like... I mean, even in the first movie, there's a good point at which he actually wants to help Loki, even though he thinks Loki's clearly the bad guy.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like he is prone to more going into moral morasses than, say, Captain America is.
The Charmer is 100% Black Widow.
Yeah.
The Lost Soul and the Professor are kind of both the Hulk.
Sure.
And
I can see that.
That's what brings me to a point that I was really trying to get at like 20 minutes ago. That right before I introduced this book. And this is a chapter in the book, using the archetypes to create characters. Now, I don't want to just straight up read from the book anymore. But one of the things that they talk about in here are core archetypes, evolving archetypes, and layered archetypes.
Mm-hmm.
And the core archetypes are just what they are. Mr. Spock. Like you know what I mean? Like he's just one of the archetypes, basically. The evolving archetypes are people who start from one archetype and change into a completely different one by the end. So I would say Hulk in Avengers starts off as the Lost Soul and ends up as the Professor. Literally, he becomes Professor Hulk by the end of that franchise. Right. So do you know what I'm saying? But at the first one, he's very removed. He was in Calcutta. Like he was off the map. He was lost, literally. And that is the evolving archetype. And then lastly, you have the layered archetype, which is basically when you take two or more of them. And if you do more than two, you start getting a little convoluted. But when you take two archetypes and you mash them together into making one character. And it's very easy to say Thor is maybe a little bit of either the warrior and the Lost Soul, or the swashbuckler and the Lost Soul, or
he's got swashbuckler attributes for sure, and he has, I would say, warrior and swashbuckler. They're very close together, but like he has those attributes. I would say. Where do you pick up like the Lost Soul attributes from?
Well, here's the thing, and this is what's very important, I think, to point out. In the very first Avengers film, I don't think he's the Lost Soul, but I think he's a convoluted of several of these. And I think that's what makes...
Yeah, that's right.
That's what makes Thor one of the less impressive characters in that movie, right? Everybody's there to kind of see Cap and Iron Man butt heads, right? And they kind of steal the show because they are core archetypes. They're not muddled. Yeah. The Hulk was a surprising thing in there because we hadn't gotten a Hulk who was so layered and complex, right? And I don't even think that Black Widow had been so well defined as a core archetype until this movie.
Sure.
Hawkeye, we're not going to count because he was brainwashed the entire movie.
Sure.
But when you get to the point of Avengers Infinity War, Thor is very much the Lost Soul.
Yeah, no, you're right.
He's lost everybody. He's lost his people. He's lost his parents. He's lost his friends. He's lost his brother. Do you know what I mean? He's lost his fucking home world. Like everything is gone. And then you see in Endgame, he's kind of going from, I would say, from Lost Soul to Warrior. Yeah. Like that's very clearly defined. And it's an evolvement of that. And that's the thing. And I think that's very important in terms of not only layering your characters, but if you're using them over and over and over again, and like you have to, because you are in a what's the long form storytelling, right?
Yeah.
But if you're doing like repeated episodic nature or franchise, multiple movies or whatever, it's okay to take your characters who are a core character and transition them to another archetype, right? They're still the same character, but it's basically like, what would this archetype do if they were wearing this character's costume? And that's what keeps characters interesting. So really, you could take any archetype and put them in your story. I'm talking to everybody out there. Yeah. And you can keep it going, and you can just move in and out of these archetypes, and you can really wring the juice out of your story and your character by and you know what I mean? It'll keep it fresh, because the Captain America in Captain America First Avenger is not the same Captain America in Civil War. He's a different archetype in each one of those movies. Yeah. He is changing as it goes through, and that's why he's not as interesting in his first movie as he is in the last. And it's arguable that you could say he's almost come full circle by the end of by Endgame. He's back to where he started, but he's so much more layered. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like, it's so much more interesting having gone through all those different archetypes with him. And that's what I really think is important for people to understand, is that you don't have to be locked into one core archetype. You can mash them together. You can transition between them, or if it does work in your story, you can keep them as one core archetype, and then you're good. So whatever your problem is, there is a solution.
Absolutely. And in sort of interrelating that with Carl Jung's ideas about archetypes, his whole notion with it was that any given person in their interior psychology, right, because they will inevitably like form a story for their life, you know, like what he called a personal mythology. Within your life story, you're going to play all those different archetypes. Sure. And there are going to be people in your lives that will switch archetypes. Like, there will be a point in your life where your father might be the wise old man, and then later on might be like a different archetype, might be more of a trickster, might be more of just, you know, the best friend or whatever. Yep. Whereas you might, in time, as you grow older, become the wise old man. And that's how you start to view yourself, as opposed to, you know, maybe viewing yourself as the fool at one point or whatever. So, like, interrelating that with story writing, what I always like to reiterate all the time is, like, you know, start from your own personal life with the stories that you write, and then you can piece together and take apart all the people in your lives that kind of create your memories. And you can create characters from that, right? If you need to look for I always like to reiterate, like, that's the place I think is the first place to look from, because that's where you're going to get the most sincere, authentic events and characters to write in your stories. And then and then you can kind of say, okay, you know, maybe this friend in my life was this kind of archetype. And then that gives you an idea for a character that you can pull from as either a supporting character, main character, or whatever. There are always an infinite number of ways to, like, you know, mess around the creative process, but that's just like one suggestion I would give to those out there who are, you know, maybe you're starting a new story or whatever, and you need a little bit of juice, a little inspiration to pull from in the moment. So I know we've moved into the hour, Jow. Is there anything else that you want to finish the episode on?
No, I just want to reiterate that book one more time. Heroes and Heroines, The Complete Writer's Guide, 16 Master Archetypes by Tammy D. Cowden, Caro Lefevre, and Sue Viters, if anybody's interested. I really enjoyed the book, and I think it's definitely helpful if you're having character struggles, or just, you know, filling out how to make them interact with each other and understanding the whole thing. I found the book to be very helpful, so I would recommend that. But I think that's it. I think that's all I got. So unless you got anything else, Mr. Rainwater, we will say goodnight. All right. We'll see you guys next week. Bye-bye.
Good night.